British royal family, saints and sinners. Or why, in each generation, is one Windsor above reproach and another set up to take the fall? Prince Harry and Meghan have dominated headlines in recent weeks, with their cries of being harassed by the British press and treated unfairly by the royal family. You may love or loathe the Sussexes, or sympathize with how they've been treated, but feel they're being rather hypocritical by calling fowl on the media, whilst capitalizing on their fame and airing their family's dirty laundry. Either way, it is fascinating to see that the contrasting media portrayal of the two brothers, William as the saintly heir and Harry as the naughty spare, has been going on in the British royal family for nearly 200 years, going back to King George IV and Queen Victoria. In each era or generation, some in the dynasty, usually the current monarch and heir apparent, are portrayed by the media and history as bastions of morally upright behavior, faithfulness to God, family, and country, and a glowing example of the values of their time. Meanwhile, another family member, either a spare to the throne or someone out of the succession for one reason or another, is labeled a cad, a playboy, morally corrupt, an abandoner of family and public duty, a criminal, or even just an idiot. In Season 3, Episode 2 of the Netflix series The Crown, the character of Prince Philip gives a speech on exactly this topic, explaining to Elizabeth that while she, her father, and grandfather were all dutiful, reliable, and heroic, but dull, each generation has had a contrasting member who is dazzling, brilliant, and individualistic, but dangerous, like her sister, Margaret. Creating this dichotomy of a saintly monarch or heir and their sinner sibling serves the firm well. As the monarchy only survives because of continued support from the public, it is essential that those on the throne be loved and respected. Their good behavior is highly publicized, while missteps are covered up or downplayed. Meanwhile, having someone in the family to point at as an example of bad behavior serves as a distinction and a kind of, well, at least we don't have them on the throne, pressure valve. The palace public relations machine and complicit media perpetuate these roles time and again. This is not to say that good or bad reputations are without substance, but in some cases, media caricatures have become self-fulfilling prophecies. We are even beginning to see this dichotomy take shape with the youngest princes, George and Louis. Let's take a look back at the saints and sinners in each era of the British royal family and examine if the saints were really as good and the sinners as bad as they have been portrayed. Since Anglo-Saxon times, kings ruled based on their ability to compel an army to fight for them. Monarchs were absolute, and whether or not they were good people was immaterial. But in the 1640s, Parliament rose up against King Charles I in the English Civil War. They chopped off his head and abolished the monarchy. A decade later, they invited his son to retake the throne as Charles II. But now the monarchy was no longer absolute, but constitutional, meaning he ruled at the behest of the people. Royal behavior was no longer above reproach. The Georgian kings were all greatly criticized by the growing Fourth Estate. Pamphlets lambasted their unpopular political maneuvers, and cartoons drew them as mistress-chasing buffoons. George III and Queen Charlotte watched in horror as the media dragged their French counterparts, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, culminating in a revolution and a date with Madame Guillotine. George, who was far more morally upright than his ancestors anyway, tried to rehab the family's reputation and keep his own head. He and Charlotte made philanthropy and family the new focus of the dynasty. Their sons, however, inherited the Hanoverian streak of lust and gluttony. Several of them had mistresses and illegitimate children, which their parents tried to cover up. Both George IV and William IV took a turn on the throne, and both were seen as morally bankrupt. Towards the end of his life, George IV rarely left his lavish palaces for fear of public ridicule, and he was mocked even in death. The monarchy was at a very low point when his niece, Victoria, inherited the throne at 18. After a few early brushes with public disapproval, the young queen developed a horror of going down the same path as her predecessors. Victoria began the tradition of brides wearing white, a symbol of purity. She chose for her husband German Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. When he was a child, his father had kicked his mother out for adultery. She died of cancer shortly after. Albert shared Victoria's horror of immorality. Unusually for an upper-class man of the time, he is believed to have been a virgin on his wedding night and to have remained faithful to his wife unto death. Together, Victoria and Albert launched a new royal family that would be a shining example of morality. When her husband died at 42, she wore black and remained faithful to his memory for the rest of her life. The relationship she likely had with John Brown was covered up. Queen Victoria became a worldwide icon of strict personal righteousness. She influenced the Victorian era's return to rigid standards of behavior and gender norms. These ideals were perverted into the argument that Britain, by virtue of its moral superiority, had an obligation to conquer nations across the globe in order to teach others the correct way to live. The elderly queen became the benevolent mother of the empire, whether they liked it or not. Britain's imperial prosperity brought the monarchy a great deal of respect from businessmen, including those who published newspapers. Since then, the royal family have enjoyed a great deal of oversight on which stories the mainstream media releases about them. Victoria and Albert expected their 9 children to adhere to their strict moral code, but in their eldest son, the future King Edward VII, they were gravely disappointed. When news of a youthful affair with an actress reached his parents, they were mortified. Prince Albert caught the next train to visit his son and berate him. Days later, Albert died of typhoid fever. Victoria blamed Edward for causing the death of her beloved husband, and she never forgave him. She rushed to find her son a bride, believing marriage would put an end to his lusty behavior. It did not. Princess Alexandra of Denmark was willing to look the other way, while Edward carried on affairs with at least 50 mistresses. His lovers included British aristocrats, American heiresses, and actresses. He made frequent trips to Paris to patronize brothels, and as his waist expanded, he had a special chair designed so that he could have sex without crushing his partner. Queen Victoria died in 1901. Her pristine image was protected by her youngest daughter, Beatrice, who transcribed a lifetime worth of the Queen's journals, editing out any unsaintly bits and burning the originals. Victoria's reputation was solidified for decades until her correspondence were published, painting her as a more complete person who threw temper tantrums, bullied her children, loved sex with her husband, and occasionally roared with laughter. After the 63-year reign of his righteous mother, many were apprehensive about having notorious adulterer Edward VII on the throne, but he turned out to be a far better monarch than virtuous Victoria expected. He was a peacemaker in the growing tensions among his European relatives. He spoke against racism and supported the rights of the poor and the working class, though he opposed women's suffrage. When Edward VII was on his deathbed at 68, his doctor was horrified that His Majesty's impending death might appear first in the vulgar evening news. So he gave the king a lethal injection to ensure that he would make the deadline for the more proper morning edition. Edward's eldest son and heir, Prince Albert Victor, dealt with a few scandals in his lifetime. He reportedly had an affair with the chorus girl, Lydia Manton, who committed suicide by drinking carbolic acid. But a friend took the fall for the prince in the coroner's inquest. He was also implicated in the Cleveland Street scandal. A homosexual brothel was exposed to have numerous high-profile clients, including one of the prince's closest friends. This scandal, too, was covered up by the British press, but the American newspapers had a field day. Albert Victor died of influenza at 28, and the death of the would-be king was mourned as a tragic loss for Britain. The throne and his fiancée, Princess Mary of Teck, instead went to his younger brother George. He had grown up in the Navy and was a dull and unimaginative man who spent his time collecting stamps. He and Queen Mary modeled upper-class ideals of morality. George is not known to have had any mistresses. He was earnestly devoted to Britain and the Commonwealth. He dealt well with two major crises. He signed the Home Rule Bill, releasing Southern Ireland from the United Kingdom and avoiding civil war. And when Britain fought World War I against his cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, George made the prudent decision to renounce his German titles and change the family name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to the English Windsor. It wasn't until after George V's death that a sinner was cast to make him appear even more saintly by contrast. Biographies of the king, published in the 1950s, painted his elder brother, Prince Albert Victor, as lazy, ill-educated, and physically feeble. The Cleveland Street scandal was dredged up, as were private letters in which Queen Victoria admonished her grandson for immoral behavior. It was strongly suggested that the prince was homosexual, which in the 1950s was still illegal. In 1962, it was alleged that Albert Victor may have been Jack the Ripper, the slasher who murdered 5 women in 1888 and was never caught. It was theorized that the prince either went on a killing spree after contracting syphilis, or that a henchman committed the murders to cover up the prince having an illegitimate child with a friend of the victims. All of these accusations remain completely unfounded. Albert Victor's posthumous reputation had become so rotten that one writer called his death a merciful act of providence, supporting the theory that his demise removed an unsuitable heir to the throne and replaced him with the reliable and sober George V. George's eldest son, Prince Edward, also had a strong playboy streak. He'd had many affairs over the years, and when one of his former lovers murdered her husband, the palace worked desperately to keep the prince's name out of coverage of her salacious murder trial. When the 42-year-old came to the throne as King Edward VIII, he was head over heels for a married American, Wallis Simpson. She had already been divorced once and wanted to divorce again to marry the king. The government and the church wouldn't stand for it. At that time, divorce was not recognized by the Church of England. Edward was given a choice, Wallis or the throne. He chose Wallis and left the responsibility of kingship to his ill-prepared younger brother. The British public were blindsided by the announcement, as nothing about the king's affairs had been printed in UK newspapers. But in the US, the story had been grabbing headlines for months. George VI chose his regnal name to emphasize continuity with his father, particularly in their shared morality. He was married to Scottish noble Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. Their love match launched a new era of rejecting loveless arranged marriages, which often resulted in rampant infidelity. The expectation was that spouses who were in love would never be unfaithful. But George's fidelity has recently been called into question. He had a decades-long infatuation and close friendship with actress Evelyn Leigh. George frequently attended her performances and met her backstage. She coached him to improve his stammer. Whether or not they actually had an affair remains unknown. Evelyn was discreet and refused to talk about the king to the press. George and Elizabeth were incredibly popular symbols of national pride during World War II. Even more so in contrast to his brother, Edward, who was scorned for failing in his duty. Edward and Wallis vacationed in Portugal while the world was at war. Wallis ordered soldiers into danger to retrieve her favorite swimsuit, and Edward badgered his brother to increase his allowance and grant his wife the title HRH. Years later, it was revealed to the public that Wallis was a Nazi sympathizer who had been sleeping with the German ambassador during her relationship with the king. With war looming, she took Edward to Germany to meet Adolf Hitler. The Fuhrer even planned to reinstate Edward as a puppet king when he conquered Britain. George VI died in 1952 and passed the throne to his eldest daughter, Queen Elizabeth II. She modeled her behavior and public image after her saintly father and grandfather, emphasizing duty to family, God, and country. Her younger sister Margaret said of their childhood, "She was made to be the goody-goody. That was boring, so the press tried to make me out to be wicked as hell." While Elizabeth was straight-laced and obedient, Margaret was charming and a bit naughty. Elizabeth modeled the ideal 1950s nuclear family, while Margaret fell in love with a married man, Peter Townsend. He divorced and the couple planned to wed, but the Queen refused to give her permission. Margaret broke things off with Peter and later wed photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones. Their marriage imploded in drama and infidelities on both sides. Margaret became the first member of the royal family to divorce since Henry VIII. She continued to grab headlines with her affairs and heavy drinking. Though the sisters remained close throughout their lives, there's no question that Margaret's flamboyant reputation and terrible press was a convenient distraction for any negative coverage about the Queen. Though her happy, nuclear family may not have been as perfect as she projected, her husband Philip has long been whispered to have had secret rendezvous with mistresses, but the loyal British media covered much of it up. Rumors of an affair during Elizabeth's first pregnancy ruined the career of actress Pat Kirkwood. In 1956, Philip left his young family to tour the world on the royal yacht Britannia. The atmosphere aboard the ship was a non-stop bachelor party. When Philip's equerry became embroiled in a divorce scandal, Philip was quickly made a prince so that he could not be compelled to testify about what had happened on the boat. Greek cabaret singer Helen Cordet had 2 children, Max and Louise, out of wedlock, but she never said who their father was. Philip was made godfather to both and paid Max's tuition to his own alma mater, Gordonston, leading many to suspect that Philip was their father. The prince allegedly also had flings with TV presenter Katie Boyle, actress Meryl Oberon, actress Anne Massey, novelist Daphne du Maurier, and his daughter-in-law Sarah Ferguson's mother, Susan Barantz. However, none of these alleged affairs made it into the news. Elizabeth's children got into far more hot water than previous generations. This was partly due to the rise in tabloid journalism. In prior eras, the BBC and The Times followed the royal family's guidelines on what they could print and often covered up scandals. But by the 1980s, tabloids were making a mint from printing salacious stories. Charles, heir to the throne, was initially cast by the firm as Prince Charming, with a beautiful young bride. But paparazzi hounded Diana, adding to her mental health struggles. The press soon sniffed out the truth of their miserable marriage and splashed Charles's affair with Camilla Parker Bowles all over newsstands. The image of the ideal future king was irrevocably tarnished, though the firm has been working hard since to get his reputation back on track. It has helped that his younger brother, Andrew, disgraced himself so severely that Charles looks far more saintly by comparison. From childhood, stories of Andrew pulling pranks made their way out of the palace. He was cast as a teen heartthrob and nicknamed Randy Andy. His romance with American photographer Koo Stark made headlines, while far less was printed about his older siblings' early relationships. Andrew wed Sarah Ferguson. She was frustrated with how the press cast her sister-in-law Diana as the saint and she as the sinner, stating Bad Fergie sold an awful lot of papers. Andrew and Sarah divorced the same year as Charles and Diana, though it was Sarah who grabbed headlines for infidelity. Andrew continued to be the foil to his older brother. Stories of the Prince of Wales marrying his longtime mistress or meddling in politics were tempered by the Duke of York's business buffoonery and shady dealings in the Middle East. But the biggest controversy of Andrew's life has been his friendship with sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. One of Epstein's victims, Virginia Roberts Guffrey, claimed that she was forced to have sex with Andrew on numerous occasions when she was a minor. Andrew denied everything in a TV interview, but he came out looking even more guilty. He managed to dodge a criminal conviction, but after public outrage, the palace announced that he would be stripped of military honors, charity patronages, and would no longer represent the royal family in public. While Andrew's actions are inexcusable, you have to wonder if being dubbed Randy Andy from childhood might have been a self-fulfilling prophecy. Charles's eldest son, William, has been groomed by the palace and the press as the great hope for the future of the monarchy. His happy marriage to charming Catherine, their adorable children, and their PR savvy have made them media darlings. But the old trope of making the heir look saintly at the expense of the spare is as strong as ever. Prince Harry was only 12 when his mother died in a car crash while being chased by paparazzi. It's little surprise that this impacted his mental health and relationship with the media. His youthful forays into dating, drinking, and drugs were lapped up by the tabloids. Meanwhile, William's equally rambunctious dating and partying were kept out of the papers. Reportedly, the rift in their relationship began in 2005, when Harry made headlines for wearing a Nazi uniform. William attended the same natives and colonials themed party, and he actually suggested the Nazi costume to his brother. The subsequent media debacle opened Harry's eyes to the roles he and William were being corralled into. Resentments continued to mount as William tried to get in the way of his relationship with Meghan Markle. All appeared well when Harry and Meghan wed in 2018, but as their popularity began to outshine that of the heir, members of the firm reportedly decided things needed to return to the long-established dynamic. Media coverage of Catherine and Meghan has been starkly different. Most notoriously, the same paper praised Kate for eating healthy avocado while pregnant, and when Meghan enjoyed the same snack, she was accused of fueling human rights abuse, drought, and murder. 72 female members of the British Parliament sent an open letter to Meghan condemning the unfair and racist coverage she had received. In 2020, the couple announced they would step away from their roles as senior royals and move to North America. Predictably, tabloids dubbed the departure Megxit and blamed Meghan for the breakup of the royal family. The couple dropped a bomb on the royals with an explosive interview with Oprah Winfrey in 2021. In 2022, Queen Elizabeth died and Charles became king. Since then, Harry and Meghan have been flooding the media with their side of the story and trying to win sympathy in a Netflix docuseries, multiple interviews, and a tell-all autobiography. Harry has made public private conversations and confrontations, which put his father, stepmother, and brother in less than admirable light. Harry has said that Camilla was so eager to rehab her own bad reputation that she sacrificed him on her personal PR altar. He claims that both she and Charles used he and William to get better tabloid coverage for themselves. Charles and Camilla already had rocky reputations, and with their reign so new and their coronation looming, this is bad press they don't need. Harry also disclosed an argument with his brother over Meghan, during which William became physically violent and attacked him. The fraternal Cold War, others' corroboration of William's notorious temper, and allegations of an affair with Catherine's former friend, Rose Hanbury, make the once irreproachable Prince of Wales now look far less the ideal future king. Public reception of the Sussexes' recent media forays has been mixed, but much of the British media continues to vilify the Sussexes in increasingly shrill terms. They are, per usual, protecting the royal family, which also, per usual, remains silent on the issues. Whatever may be true or false in Harry's account, this marks the first time in 6 generations that a spare stepped out of their predestined role of court jester to fling mud back at the institution. The casting of the saintly heir and the sinning spare is far from over. The dichotomy is already forming around the youngest members of the Windsor family. During the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, 8-year-old Prince George looked fit for a crown in his suit and tie. Meanwhile, his younger brother, 4-year-old Louis, stole the show with his cheeky hijinks. Many saw his behavior as the adorable antics of a young child forced to sit still for hours. But some news commenters criticized his mother for bad parenting and even called Louis a brat. It remains to be seen if George and Louis will be able to write their own narratives, or if they will be condemned to play out the roles of saint and sinner, which have marked their family for generations. Want even more tea on history? Check out the History Tea Time podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and check out my other royal history videos. If you really want to help, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A link is in the description. Thank you for watching.